Hello, vinyl community. This is Tommy in North Carolina, and I want to make a video here where I have a little bit of a discussion and perhaps spark some of you to maybe comment, interact, maybe make a video response of your own concerning something. And I'll go ahead and give a little backstory. This is in regards to the recent announcement in the last couple of weeks for the people, the bands and artists that are eligible to be nominated for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in Cleveland. And this is kind of the first step in whoever actually gets in. There's actually a fan vote, which is quite interesting that they've implemented in the last few years. And so they released this list of bands that are eligible and who's going to be on the ballot. And then in a couple of months, they'll actually release who gets nominated. Now, I'm not going to get into the whys and why nots of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Like any list, like any award, anything like that, there's going to be a bit of disagreement and people that are going to see it one way and some people that are the other. The main thing is the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a private club and it's a private business, and they can let in who they want and they can keep out who they want. So it's completely up to them, and so I respect that. And fans of a particular band or artist do not need the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame to give their artist validation. If you are a fan of a certain artist and you love that person's music, then by all means you should love that music, and it shouldn't matter what anyone else thinks about it. It's completely up to you. But I do want to take this moment because every year it sparks a little bit of debate when they talk about overlooked or missed bands in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And you may have guessed from my shirt, hey, hey, we're the Monkees. I'm going to talk a little bit about the Monkees, the prefabricated four. Now, this was a group that was put together for a television show in the late 60s, 1966. It was going to be sort of a weekly sitcom version of A Hard Day's Night. And so this was a group of four young men that were to be like the Beatles. And through an audition process, they were picked, these four guys, David Jones, Peter Tork, Mickey Dolenz, and Michael Nesmith. And now, one of the big misconceptions about the Monkees is that Michael and Peter were the only musicians and Mickey and Davey were the only two actors. That's not true. Mickey had a musical background. He played guitar. He was singing. David Jones had spent time on Broadway. He was the original Artful Dodger in the musical The Oliver on Broadway. Peter Tork was very proficient, probably the most proficient musically of the Monkees. I think he was very good at about 19 instruments. He could play pretty much anything. And Nesmith had kind of a folk background. Now, on the other hand, Nesmith had some theater in his past. And so they interchanged. And so that's a big sort of lie that's been told over the years, and people still believe it, that, you know, there was only one real musician in the Monkees and so on and so forth. That's not true. And we'll get a little more into that later on. But just kind of starting off, this is their debut album that came out. Now, one of the things that kind of has been a debate amongst fans and scholars is that did the music drive the show or did the show drive the music? It was probably a little bit of both. But I would like to point out, I believe that Last Train to Clarksville, which was their first #1 hit, was the #1 before the TV show even debuted. So, in other words, people heard this song on the radio, they went out and bought the singles, it drove the sales up the charts, and it came to #1 without ever having seen any of them on a TV show. Now, going forward with that, one of the big problems with the Monkees, and if you look at the back cover of their first album, which this is it, there's a little bit of a bio for each member down here. David Jones, he plays guitar and sings. Mike Nesmith plays guitar and sings. Peter Tork plays guitar and sings. Mickey Dolenz plays drums and sings. Well, the truth is, the only Monkee that played on this whole album, or only two Monkees that played on this album, Michael Nesmith wrote and sang a couple of songs, and he let Peter Tork be one of the 6 guitarists on Papa Gene's Blues, one of his own compositions. And so that's a big thing. They weren't playing and singing really anything on here, but they were all singing. So if you heard Mickey sing, that's this guy singing the vocals. And so this becomes the big problem with the Monkees. They weren't a real band. Okay, so that causes a lot of confusion for people because, what do you mean they're not a real band? This is obviously a record with real music on it. So it's probably one of the first great controversies in music. Now let me go back and give a little backstory. In the late 80s, around 86, the Monkees had a little bit of a comeback. They had a hit song, That Was Then, This Is Now. And the shows were re-airing on MTV and Nickelodeon. And so there was a whole new generation of fans. I was about 11 or 12 years old when this was going on. And so I was just enthralled with a musical TV show. I'd already loved music. I'd already loved rock music and was getting into 60s music. And so I thought it was a funny show. I thought the music was clever and catchy. And so I fell in love with it, but I never made any pretenses that these guys were an actual band that were playing. Now, the show was about these four guys that lived in an apartment and on the beach and had a good time, and they lip-synced on the TV show. And so people were really angry in the 60s when they found out that this wasn't real, that it was all a facade. And you kind of want to say, well, really? So, having said that, it's really interesting because, Monkees have been sort of divided into two very distinct camps. You have people that really, really, really love the Monkees, and then you have these people that really have never listened to the Monkees because they're a fake band, and we don't like fake bands. But I don't understand how a fake band can make fake music. And so, tying into that, here's a really fake band, the Archies. And they had a huge hit with Sugar Sugar, but the Archies was a comic strip group. Now this ties into the Monkee story a little bit because Don Kirshner was hired as the music supervisor for the Monkees TV show. And I think Michael in particular, Peter, and I think to the rest of them to a lesser degree, were under the impression that they were going to be writing and playing music on their own. And the schedule didn't really allow for it. I mean, you had a TV schedule shooting as well as a music recording schedule to follow, and it was very hectic because they had to keep up with one another and complement each other. And so there was a big confrontation with Don Kirshner about control over the music. And Kirshner was actually fired from the Monkees project by the producers because he refused to let these guys have control of their music. Well, the famous story is Don Kirshner was presenting the Monkees with gold records, and he was saying, he played this demo of the song Sugar Sugar and said, "This is your next single, guys." And Michael Nesmith said, "No way." Now, Kirshner was probably a little vilified later on because, or vindicated, because this song was a hit, Sugar Sugar, for the Archies. But in the course of a year, and this is the really interesting aspect of this whole Monkee story, in the course of a year when the TV show debuted, the four guys in the band did wrestle control over the musical output and was able to write and record. So by their third album, titled Headquarters, this album featured all four Monkees playing every note. The only additional musician was the occasional brass player and the producer Chip Douglas, who played bass. Who Nesmith actually brought in. But as an album, this came out less than a year from the debut, and this album features the four guys playing. Now, this came out, I believe, in May of '67. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but it came out right before Sgt. Pepper, and as we all know, the Sgt. Pepper album kind of opened the waters for music, and this kind of seemed a little quaint. The Monkees, at best, were a decent garage band. I'd love to report that this album is just full of brilliance and just great playing. It's not. You can tell that these four guys probably wouldn't be a band, just kind of working it out. But it kind of sparks the whole debate about, what the Monkees were and their legitimacy to music. Now, my argument would be that through the original run of shows and through the 80s revival, the Monkees inspired a lot of young people to get into pop rock music. They were a gateway into that. And so a lot of people that saw that show that were probably too young and not hip enough to be into the whole whatever movement was going on. And you got to think, too, a little bit of history in the 66, 67, that was sort of when rock journalism was being born. And so you kind of had this snobbish sort of attitude that was coming about. And so there was no way a teeny bopper type show was going to garner any kind of serious attention from these guys when they had people like Jimi Hendrix and these serious musicians to look up to and admire and write about. And so the Monkees kind of got dumped into this camp of image and perception. which really wasn't fair to the group because no one could take them seriously at that point. Now, granted, here's the thing about the Monkees. They had a lot of top-class songwriters working on the project. Neil Diamond, Neil Sedaka, Jerry Goffin and Carole King, all were writing songs for the Monkees, and so they had the pick of everything they could possibly want. And from about 67 to 68, they were really all over the charts, and people were just buying up their music as quick as they could get as quickly as they could get their hands on it. But that begs the question, and a lot of people talk about it. Well, still at the same time, they weren't a real band. Now, fast forward a little bit later into 67, and they released this album, Pisces Aquarius Capricorn Jones Limited, which was kind of their answer to Sgt. Pepper, but a lot of people had answers to Sgt. Pepper back then. But again, they kind of were they still had musical control, but they were playing less. So they were still doing the TV show at this time. They were still kind of keeping control over the music, but there were session people back on this album. Now, here comes the main argument. When you listen to an album like, let's say, Pet Sounds, which is a very highly praised album, a lot of people consider it one of the greatest albums of all time, and I understand why. But when you think about it, the Beach Boys, the only thing the Beach Boys have to do with that album, aside from Brian Wilson, who produced and wrote it, was the singing and the voices, and I think maybe Carl Wilson had a few guitar parts. But the Beach Boys weren't playing all those instruments and making all that sound on the record. And that goes back to there were a lot of people that cut records in the 60s like that, a lot of bands that cut records like that in the 60s. As a matter of fact, the early Bird stuff featured session guys because the actual Birds weren't competent enough in the studio to lay down tracks in the time frame, and so there were session people on those records. Now later on, that was them playing, but again, when you listen to Mr. Tambourine Man, I think the only Bird that's actually on that record is Roger McGuinn playing the 12-string guitar. And no one is arguing that the Birds are an important rock and roll band and their place in history. Now, before you go overboard and things get out of hand, no, I'm not comparing the Monkees to the Birds. I don't think they're even in the same league as far as bands are concerned. But, I will say that if you're going to hold it over the Monkees that they didn't play on their records, well, then there's a lot of artists that didn't play on their records. There's a great documentary called The Wrecking Crew. It's all about those guys in the 60s in LA that were cutting those records. And there's a whole kind of history between the LA music scene and the San Francisco music scene. And I won't get into that either, but I mean the San Francisco scene was seen as sort of this legitimate real music, the psychedelic thing. Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, bands like that were coming out of Frisco. Janis Joplin, and then you go down the coast to L.A., and then you had people like the Birds and the Monkees, and it was this very polished sort of thing. Throw Buffalo Springfield into that L.A. thing. So L.A. versus San Francisco is a whole other debate. But going back to the Monkees and getting back kind of into that story, fast forward to 68, the show gets canceled, and I think everybody was kind of burned out. Robert Rafelson, who went on to be a very acclaimed director, was the producer of the Monkees, and they did a motion picture, and it was called Head. This is the soundtrack to the movie Head. And if you've ever seen Head, I highly, but if you haven't seen it, I highly recommend it. It's a 60s movie that holds its own. It's wild. Jack Nicholson was one of the writers, and so the Monkees project had a lot of really interesting names attached to it. And because of that success, a lot of those guys went on to do movies like Easy Rider. Like I said, Jack Nicholson's career kind of got a little bit of a jump start. Now, the movie was a commercial bomb. The record was a commercial bomb. But those that have heard this, they know. So don't be so quick to dismiss the Monkees without having heard some of this later stuff. Well, Peter Tork later left the band, and it was carried on as a threesome. Then Michael Nesmith left. And I'll always tell people, anyone who's willing to listen, I'm a Michael Nesmith fan. I am more of a Nesmith fan than I am even a Monkees fan. I enjoy the stuff he did with the Monkees, and I love the Monkees music. But I'm a Michael Nesmith fan through and through, and it's a shame that his solo career wasn't able to be taken more seriously. And I think because he had that stigma of being that guy in the Monkees, that no one was willing to give him a chance, no matter how brilliant his music was. Now, Nesmith has gone on to have a varied career in various media fields, and so I'm not going to get into all that. I'm going to get back onto the Monkees thing and their legitimacy. So a couple of things I want to add to the statement or to the argument is that you kind of go forward several years, and I remember when the Milli Vanilli thing came out. Now, Milli Vanilli wasn't a TV show, but I remember Milli Vanilli had a big hit record in the late 80s, and people found out that it wasn't really those two guys on the record. Now, I've got a good friend of mine named Nobi who bought the Milli Vanilli record because he genuinely liked the music. Now, this goes back to this really kind of interesting aspect of it. So, once it came out that Milli Vanilli wasn't a real group and they had to return their Grammy Award, and it was like a big stink and a big controversy, Arista Records, who put out the record, offered a refund for that album. Well, Nobi, to his credit, did not ask for the refund. You know why? Because he liked the music. He didn't care that it wasn't those two guys. He thought the songs were good. So that kind of added a little integrity to it. He liked it. But I'm going to make another sort of argument for the Monkees that may kind of spark a little bit of interest and perhaps discussion. I'm going to talk about another record from the 80s, Whitesnake. And this is, thinking about this album kind of got me to thinking about the whole Monkees thing. So if you don't know the story about this album, it came out in 87. Whitesnake was a band fronted by David Coverdale. And he had a partnership with John Sykes, who was a guitarist. And they wrote and recorded this album. And this album became a huge hit based on the music videos and the tour that followed it. However, on the eve of the release of this album, David Coverdale fired the whole band, including John Sykes, and he hired all new guys to be Whitesnake. So the only guy in Whitesnake on this record is David Coverdale. Now, I do think Adrian Vandenberg went on to I think he played a solo on one of the songs, but the band that you saw in the music videos, the band that you saw on tour that was touring behind this album, was not the same band that played on it. Now, the album does give credit to those guys, John Sykes, Ainsley Dunbar, and Neil Murray. So that part is actually on the album. But if you saw those videos and you fell in love with those guys, it wasn't the band that you heard on the record. And so a lot of the brilliant guitar parts and the things people love about that album wasn't those guys. And so now they all got paid and everybody did well, but those guys that worked with the Monkees did as well. So, you know, the argument can be made. Nobody was getting ripped off, in other words, and everybody was enjoying the cash flow when it was all coming in. So that just kind of leads me to asking the question, I mean, what do you think about the Monkees and their legitimacy, if there is any? You know, and I'm not going to entertain, you know, that they were just a novelty or a joke band. At the end of the day, here's the thing. The Monkees' music was really good. And the final sort of argument or statement I want to make is, how many bands do you know from that time period, from the mid-60s, had a big comeback in the 80s, as well as still around? And if you saw one of my previous videos on late period classics, released an album on their 50th anniversary, and it was still enjoyed and loved by people, and they embarked on a major tour to support it, and people came to hear them and see them. So the interest in the Monkees has gone on forever. Now, I know that Nesmith made a statement, something along the lines of, as long as there's 9-year-olds in the world, there's going to be a place for the Monkees because of that humor and everything, and I understand what he's saying. But, you know, that leads me to the question, the music is legitimately good, and so if the music is that good and they inspired so many music that came later, I feel like they deserve a place historically in a place like the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And a lot of people now in the last 10, 15 years have kind of come around to the Monkees and said, yeah, you know, they're not a fake band, or they're not something to be dismissed, and we can enjoy it. And so I'm going to say, for the record, I enjoy the Monkees' music. I enjoy those records. I still play them pretty regularly, and there's not really a whole lot of weakness on those albums. They're fun pop rock albums. Now, no, they're not going to change the world like the Beach Boys or Zappa or the Beatles did. But as far as like just good music, it holds its own. So like and comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this and just see what you think. I hope maybe I've sparked a little bit of an idea to engage here, and we can have a good discourse on this subject. Because I'd really like to know what you think. And again, thanks for watching. Share this video with any Monkees fans in your family that might be interested. And if you have any questions or anything, let me know. But that's all for now. Follow me on Instagram and Twitter. It's TommyBurton75. I usually post when I'm spinning on there. And I'll see you guys next time. Thanks for watching.